Kia ora and welcome to Swim Chats, a podcast about ocean swimming. I'm Shona Riddell, a writer, former journalist and swimmer from Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand. For each episode, I talk to a different guest from our swim community. Remember, if you have any questions, thoughts or suggestions, you can email me at swimchatswithshona@gmail.com or follow Swim Chats on Instagram. Please hit the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. You can also leave a 5-star rating, which helps more people discover the podcast. And if you know people who you think would enjoy it, please tell them about Swim Chats. Before we get started with this episode, I'd first like to acknowledge the passing of Ben Knight, who was a marine conservation advocate here in Wellington. Ben was a guardian of Kapiti Marine Reserve, and he worked with Mountains to Sea Wellington and Sustainable Coastlines, which published some numbers on Facebook last week in a post I'll link to in the show notes. But in the post they said that Ben had led or helped to lead 1,297 cleanup events involving 18,289 participants. He ran 137 trainer events, oversaw the planting of 24,320 trees, and the removal of 67,157 litres of rubbish from our coastlines. And on a personal note, Ben helped me to organise the Sunrise Seaweed Swim in March this year, which opened Aotearoa's first seaweed festival. He wrote the safety plan for the event and he made sure that everyone was well briefed on the day. He was a lovely guy and a real champion for the ocean. He did a lot of good work and I know he inspired a lot of people, including me. So thank you, Ben. And I'll link to Mountains to Sea Wellington and Sustainable Coastlines in the show notes for people who want to learn more. All right, well, today I'm very excited to have my first returning guest to the podcast. You may remember him from April's episode where we talked about Sir Bernard Freyberg and his heroic World War I swim, and also his own heroic ultramarathon swimming. So this is John Hancock, who's come back to the podcast. Welcome back, John.
Hey, Shona, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. And so when John and I were talking about Sir Bernard's sort of colourful life and swim history, we both discovered this mutual interest in not only swim history, but literature about swim history. And we both felt there's an untapped market in New Zealand for podcasts about swim literary history.
Yes, I was saying before we started recording, Shona, that I've been quite impressed by how your podcast has taken off and you've got this enormous listenership now. So I thought I'd do something to bring that to a juddering halt and we can record a podcast that about 4 people are going to be interested in, just to bring it back down to earth. But it's been fun.
Sometimes it's good to have a niche audience of a small but very passionate group. So I think everyone will be curious about this episode, and we'll see where it takes us.
See how long we can keep. People should tell us at the end of it. I got to minute 7, I got to minute 15 and then gave up. And then,
exactly, yeah. So we'll be very interested in people's feedback, and I'm assuming people will enjoy this episode and be interested in more. In which case, we can carry on the tradition.
Yes, I mean the inspiration for this, I was trying to sort of cleverly segue back to what we talked about with Sir Bernard Freyberg, who was this sort of boy's own hero whose life just read like a cartoon comic. And the thing that it really reminded me of was this swashbuckling poet in the 19th century, Lord Byron. And this guy famously swam between Europe and Asia across the Dardanelles Strait. And his inspiration for doing this was this Greek myth, the myth of Hero and Leander. And so the story of Hero and Leander is that Leander was in love with Hero, and every night he used to swim across the Dardanelles Strait. But they called it the Hellespont. Sounds incredibly romantic. To spend time with her, which is a bit of a euphemism, I think. And every night, Hero would light a lamp, and the light would be visible from the tower. Like Juliet, she was in her tower, and he had to swim across the channel. And So he would, once he got ashore, he'd seduce her with his wonderful words. And they had this secret love affair all the way through warm summer. But when it was winter and the weather got rougher, they decided that they'd separate for the rest of the season and resume their illicit relationship in the spring. Um, but one stormy night in winter, Leander saw the torch at the top of Hero's tower and decided that that was her calling him. And so he leapt into the Hellespont, promptly lost his way and drowned. It sounds like an opera, doesn't it? One of these sort of catastrophic deaths. And of course, as soon as Hero saw his dead body wash up on the shore as an opera diva, she herself threw herself off the top of the tower and was instantly killed. And then their two bodies were discovered on the beach together, locked in a lover's embrace, and subsequently buried in a lover's tomb. So, sort of early fun from our literary swimming history. Anyway, so that's been a story in the canon, as you say, for whatever 1200 years now.
Yeah,
Um,
and one thought I had was, or actually two thoughts. One was how far was he swimming every night? Do we know that
Well,
number?
while I was reading about this, I found this incredibly nerdy swimming blog page with all the details of swimming across the Hellespont, because people do it these days. You can go on a holiday with Swim Trek Limited. So I think the straight line, it's only about sort of 1500 meters or something like that. But like a lot of our lovely tidal swims in New Zealand, it's got a very, very strong current. So there were all these sort of school geometry pictures of, you need to swim at 16 degrees against the current at so and such a speed in order to actually cross directly over the Hellespont. But yeah,
So it's
the
quite a feat of endurance to be doing that every night.
well, he
And
had a strong
the other thought,
incentive.
the other thought I, yeah, true. The, the other thought I had was, he stopped over winter and resumed in spring, and that wouldn't deter Wellington ocean swimmers, would it? They would just keep swimming the
No,
same
that's right.
every
Even if there
winter.
wasn't a light on the other side of the harbour to attract them over.
Well, a lot of people swim towards the lighthouse, don't they, in Wellington? So it's sort of similar.
Oh, maybe there's something secret going on inside the lighthouse that we've never stopped to investigate.
Yeah, if anybody wants to write in and tell us, then yeah, they can.
So anyway, so this story has been around forever and ever and ever, but I wasn't totally sort of familiar with all the sort of background. But as I was saying, there's this very, very famous 19th century poet, Lord Byron, and this guy was an he was Bernard Freyberg on steroids. He lived this incredibly colourful life. And interestingly, he had what's called a club foot. So one of his feet was turned in and it didn't really work properly. So he couldn't walk or run very comfortably, but he was a very good swimmer. And obviously, because it didn't need him to be able to take his own weight. And as this sort of boy's own hero, he was very, very athletic and he used to do boxing and fencing and whatever. And found one little detail that while he was at Trinity College, Cambridge, he kept a bear as a pet because the college rules said that you weren't allowed to have a dog. So he decided it would be much more fun to break the rules and have a bear in his own chambers. So that sort of pretty much sums the guy up.
I remember listening to a podcast about his fascinating life, and they said it was a trained circus bear and quite a small bear. So that adds a bit of context to your mental picture. Yeah, I'm sort of picturing a little Paddington bear type pet.
It's a bit like the bears at Wellington Zoo. You know, Wellington Zoo is like this incredibly small zoo that's on the side of a hill, and they've sort of specialized in really small animals. So the bear enclosure at Wellington Zoo, they have sun bears, and sun bears are very small. They're probably the sort of thing that Byron had in his chambers. But there's some absolute genius has got the bear enclosure at Wellington Zoo sponsored by Arataki honey. And I can just imagine small children all over Wellington dragging their parents to go and buy Arataki honey to go with the very small sunbears. That wasn't
It's
what we were meant
very
to be
good
talking
product
about.
placement.
um, anyway, so Byron, and we'll maybe talk about some of the other things that Byron did, but he's one of his famous long poems was about Don Juan, and Don Juan was this sort of character in history who actually sounded rather like Lord Byron. He basically slept and womanized and drank and debauched his way through life. I think in my notes I said he was a free living philanderer, and in Canto 2 of Don Juan. So Canto 2, so a canto in a epic poem is sort of I suppose it'd be like a chapter. These poems were all really, really, really long. And he tells the story of a shipwreck, and Don Juan finds himself uh, um, hanging on to a raft with lots of other survivors. And the conditions are very brutal and they're miles away from land. So they start eating each other. But Don Juan, of course, is one of the survivors. And then he washes ashore in one of the Greek islands. And uh, so there's this a beautiful sort of example of Byron talking about swimming as part of the epic tradition, which of course is one of the things that he did. And Byron's telling his readers that because Don Juan was a great swimmer, he was a great hero, just like Byron. Byron wasn't a very modest person. Um,
And
uh,
with the swimming, what style of swimming are we talking about? Do you know? Because I gather this was the time before the front crawl that most of us swim with today. Would they have been swimming breaststroke? Is
well,
that the
that's a really good question. I mean, the famous story about Captain Webb, the first man to swim the English Channel, he swam that breaststroke, didn't he?
Mm.
Um, but one of the guys who I swim with always in the pool, whenever we finish squad, he always finishes with what looks like sort of upside down breaststroke, and it's called Old English backstroke, where you do the frog legs and you do both arms at the same time. And I
Mm.
actually wonder whether that's the sort of stroke that these guys would have been sort of exploiting in the 19th century.
Yeah, it makes sense. Creates a whole different picture, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I thought the listeners might be quite interested in hearing some of Byron's great epic poem about Don Juan. Um, so as he's sort of escaping death and eating all of his fellow shipwreck companions. He's rescued, and Byron says, but in his native stream, the Guadalquivir Juan, to lave his youthful limbs was wont, and having learnt to swim in that sweet river, had oft turned the art to some account. A better swimmer you could scarce ever see, he could perhaps have passed the Hellespont, as once, a feat on which ourselves we prided, Leander, Mr. Ekenhead, and I did. So this is Byron telling the story of Don Juan and basically using it to skite about what an amazingly great swimmer he was by saying that Byron could have swum across the Hellespont as he did.
Right.
Um, yeah, so that's the segue to Byron's great sort of swim. But again, lovely callback to our conversation about Sir Bernard Freyberg. So the listeners might remember that I've outed Freyberg, who lived his life as a post-truth Trumpian, and who for my entire life has been famous for having been involved in the Mexican Civil War, that turns out simply not to have been true, but that he was very happy to let this story circulate and make him sound like a complete hero. But it turns out that Byron actually did get involved in the Greek War of Independence. So in 1823, Byron, who was an aristocrat, he was a lord when he was 18. So when he was at university, his room sort of said Lord Byron on the door. It wasn't something that happened to him later in life. So he was quite wealthy. He donated a very large chunk of his personal fortune. So about £4,000 in 1823. So I don't know what that would be worth nowadays, but it would be
$5 billion.
but this is a post-truth podcast, isn't it,
Yeah.
Shona? So but making an investment to support the Greek fleet, and very like Freyberg, he also decided that he wanted to get involved. So off he went from London down to Greece, wanted to get involved in the fight himself, and rather like Freyberg in the First World War, was given command of a corps of soldiers and uh, training with them. Unfortunately, unlike Freyberg, who I don't know if your listeners remember, was sort of shot to pieces and came out of the trenches with about sort of 2 kilos of buckshot in him, which was steadily removed, and he was virtually unable to walk at the end of it. But very, very sadly, Byron actually died of a fever before he even got to fight. So that was a rather less heroic sort of end to his life. But the thing I really wanted to talk about was Byron's famous swim across the Hellespont. We talked at the start of the interview, Shona, about Hero and Leander, and Byron and one of his mates decided that this is what they wanted to do. So that people have got this in their mind, it's very romantic, because this is the very narrow stretch of water that separates Europe and Asia. So even though it's only a kilometre or so across, you're effectively swimming from one continent to another, which is the sort of romantic thing that Lord Byron would want to do. And as we were saying, it's very, very strong currents. It's very shallow, but it separates two enormous bodies of water. So a bit like French Pass in the Marlborough Sounds, which has these incredibly strong currents because all the water is coming out of the sounds. So, on the 3rd of May, 1810, the frigate, the Salzette, arrived between Europe and Asia on the Hellespont, and Byron sort of nobbled one of the crew of this ship, the Salzette, and his name was Lieutenant Eakenhead. And Eakenhead was a notoriously good swimmer, so Byron's obviously quite sensible. And he'd actually been to Bree's safety briefings about how you should never swim alone. So carrying it forward in our Wellington world of today. And so they decided to try and replicate this famous swim of Leander from Sestos to Abydos. And it took Byron an hour and 10 minutes to do the swim. So it's not super fast, but very strong currents. But slightly humiliatingly, the sailor from the boat, Eakenhead, was 5 minutes quicker than him. Also, very prudently, they decided to take a boat with them. So they had they didn't have brightly coloured tow floats, but they had a support vessel to look after them.
Excellent. Good health and safety from Lord Byron.
Exactly. So even though he was a wild philanderer who lived life on the edge, he didn't take unnecessary risks.
And this swim would have no doubt pleased his very large fan club that he had. I remember learning that Byron's one of the earliest celebrities as we know it. Like, he received a lot of fan mail. He was very good looking, and
Exactly.
yeah, very, quite a philanderer, as you said, and he was described by a former partner as mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
I think we talked in the Bernard Freyberg episode about how Freyberg was sort of ahead of Trump in post-truth media. I think in a way Byron was ahead of the world in terms of being an influencer. I mean, he was absolutely, because he was a society guy, but everybody loved him because he was so colourful and charismatic. And
That's right.
uh, yes, but again, I thought we should read some of this. So we've heard Byron telling us a little bit about um, uh, um, Don Juan and how Don Juan was nearly as good a swimmer as him, and embedding himself that. But of course, he wrote his own little diary note about his own swim, and it's titled "Written After Swimming from Sestos to Abydos." If in the month of dark December, Leander, who was nightly wont, what maid will not the tale remember, to cross thy stream, broad Hellespont? If, when the wintry tempest roared, he sped to Hero, nothing loath, and thus of old thy current poured, fair Venus, how I pity both. For me, degenerate modern wretch, though in the genial month of May my dripping limbs I faintly stretch, and think I've done a feat today, but since he crossed the rapid tide, according to the doubtful story, to woo and, Lord knows what beside, and swam for love, as I, for glory, 'twere hard to say who fared the best. Sad mortals, thus the gods still plague you. He lost his labour, I my jest, for he was drowned, and I've the ague. Yes, and it sounds terrible in rhyming couplets because we don't really do that these days. But as you say,
It
at the
hasn't aged
time,
well.
people absolutely loved it. I
Yeah.
actually found there's a famous what they call the war poets, a guy called Rupert Brooke, who was also a student at Cambridge, and well, all of them are at Cambridge, who wrote a poem about a place just outside Cambridge at Grantchester, and he talks about Byron's swimming. And there is actually a little pond next to the river there, which is now called Byron's Pool. And Brooke wrote this little ditty about Byron's Pool, and it goes, still in the dawnlit waters cool, his ghostly lordship swims his pool, and tries the strokes, essays the tricks, long learnt on Hellespont or Styx. It, again, hasn't aged well, but anyway, it's a lovely
I like,
little
yeah, it's a lovely tribute, and I like the idea that Byron has his own pool and that his ghost is still swimming
still
there.
swimming there. That's exactly right. Anyway, but Byron was a great poet, and I don't think the things that we've read today are exactly Byron at the top of his game, but there may be more interesting to a swimming audience. He was very famously the author of a poem called "She Walks in Beauty," which I'm sure a lot of people will have heard. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. So he wasn't just cheesy rhyming couplets the whole way through. There was a bit of substance to it.
You've redeemed him.
So if we've still got any listeners going, I think people should write it at the end, and there's going to be a prize for anyone who gets to the end of the thing. But the prize at the end is that Shona's going to tell us a little bit about some more modern swimming literature. But before we get there, the thing that I really wanted to talk about wasn't Lord Byron. And people might remember that about 5 years ago, a whole bunch of us got extremely excited about this crazy Scandinavian sport where you swim with your shoes on and you run in a wetsuit. And in the most prosaically Scandinavian way imaginable, it's called swim run. But a guy from the UK who was a bit of a Lord Byron himself, really. Ex-military, went to Eton College, interested in literature. He'd named the company that he used to run swim run events Breca, and nobody knows what Breca was all about. But Breca is actually a character from the well, what would you call it? A literary epic, Beowulf. So Beowulf is one of the foundational pieces of English literature, really. It's an epic poem. It was written sometime between the 7th and 10th century. No one really knows. So this is maybe 200 years after the Greek myth of Hero and Leander, or maybe 500 years after the myth. We just don't know. Um, and I'd always thought that Beowulf was written in what was called Middle English. So Middle English is what the famous poet Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in. And I did this when I was at school. And at A level, we had to read the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. And I can still
Wow,
remember, I can
that would
still
be
remember
challenging.
I can still remember the first couplets of the Canterbury Tales. It goes, Juan that April with his sure suitor, the drocht of Merch hath persted to the rotor, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue ungendered is the floor. And it's just as embarrassing trying to read that when you're 56 as it was when I was 17. So it's good to know that nothing's changed there.
Except
Um,
the language. The language has changed a lot, hasn't it? I didn't recognize a word of that.
but I was wrong. It's Beowulf isn't written in Middle English. Chaucer was writing uh, I think 300 or 400 years after Beowulf was written. So Middle English was around sort of 1100 to 1500 AD, and Beowulf was written in about 700 AD. And the language that Beowulf is written in is called Old English, and this is based on German. Um, and it's looked it up. It's closely related to Old Frisian. So Frisian is from what's now Holland and Denmark, that part of Northern Europe, and Old Norse. Um, Whereas Middle English, by then, England had been invaded by the French, and obviously they introduced some of um, their own vocabulary. And there was an absolutely superb sentence I discovered reading about this. It said, significant changes to vowel pronunciation occurred, including the great vowel shift, which continued into the modern English period with a capital G, a capital V, and a capital S. The great vowel shift. So there you go.
Sounds like
Anyway,
a migration, doesn't it?
so that's of no interest to our swimming listeners. But what is interesting is the story of Beowulf and his childhood friend Breca. And the reason that Breca Swim Run was named after Breca rather than Beowulf is that the two of them survived a week-long battle in the sea against monstrous sea creatures. And this story is told by a character called Unferth, and he was one of the retainers of King Hrothgar, who tried to undermine Beowulf, the hero, by bringing up this sort of silly schoolboy challenge that the two of them took on. And Unferth tells the story as if Beowulf was some reckless and silly boy who was defeated by his friend Breca. But of course, Beowulf, who is the hero of the epic poem, sets the record straight and explains that they were just boys when they made this boast. Boast in Old English, the word is glip, gilp, which is rather wonderful, and that they would swim in the ocean sea for 7 nights fully armed. So, this is taking it to a next level of reality. Full armor, swords, in the North Sea, which is absolutely freezing.
And
Um,
it's in the winter, and it's, yeah, the
that's
swim
right.
happened in the winter, so it's even more freezing.
So unlike Leander, he wasn't put off by the
Yeah, that's right. Cold
difficulties of
water swimming.
swimming in cold water.
And
Um,
Unearth is telling the story in a pub, right? Or the equivalent of a pub. So,
that that's right.
yeah.
So it's all sort of exaggerated. Um, but the idea is it was a sort of endurance test, really. It wasn't a race. It's not like they were sort of racing each other down the North Sea. And they swam side by side, and then a storm blew up, of course, and they got separated. And of course, that's where the story gets really exciting. And Beowulf finds himself fighting Nicors and sea monsters. So these are the Tanifar of the North Sea. And he had to defend himself. And of course, he's conveniently wearing chainmail armor. So he swings his sword around his head, presumably while treading water. And if you thought it was embarrassing listening to me trying to pronounce Chaucer in Middle English, well, now get me trying to read Beowulf in Old English. Um, he says, Forth on flot, farming, he als, fugle, Jelikost. And roughly translated, that means forth on the flood, foamy necked, most like a bird. And this is trying to describe what the seas that Beowulf was fighting the monster looked like. Um,
When you
Huff.
were, sorry,
Oh,
when you were reading the Old English, it
yep.
sounded like we were playing you backwards. It sounded backwards.
It'll be like those conspiracy theorists who say if you play some of the early Beatles songs backwards, you get.
Exactly. You're probably saying something like "just keep swimming," just keep swimming backwards.
Um,
So do you think we should be wearing chainmail in the sea? Would this be good protection for us against?
well, it's funny, I'd forgotten about this. There is a story that when Peter Jackson was shooting The Lord of the Rings in Wellington, and we had all these Hollywood film stars living on the Miramar Peninsula, very famously, Viggo Mortensen, who was 6'8" heroic warrior, um, is a method actor. And famously, the Weta Studios had made him a suit of chainmail and an absolutely enormous sword, rather like Breca and Beowulf. And every morning he would run round the Miramar Peninsula wearing full chainmail with this enormous sword. And every single morning, the police would really receive a phone call from some alarmed lady who'd seen this enormous Viking running around the Miramar Peninsula with an enormous sword. And so they went to go and see him, and they said, Mr. Mortensen, we do understand that this is part of your process and totally respect your right as a free citizen to do these things. But we were just wondering whether you could maybe leave the sword at home next time you go out. So that's I mean, who would be better to play Breca or Beowulf than Viggo Mortensen in his full Lord of the Rings thing? So we could shoot it. We
Yeah,
could
we could.
shoot.
I mean, Peter Jackson's just down the road, so we can present our pitch to him. So,
Um,
so Beowulf and Breca were in the sea for a week,
yep.
first competing, swimming against each other, and then got separated, and then Beowulf was engaged with some sea monsters of unknown origin. But I'm guessing at this time they hadn't identified many marine creatures, and so we're thinking dragons, whales, what a
Or just
jellyfish.
or just the froth on the
Yeah, just the front.
on the water, and the presumably your brain starts playing very funny tricks on you if you've been
Yeah, maybe
swimming
he was
around.
just hallucinating.
Yeah.
But it does seem quite timely because just a couple of days ago in the harbour, we had a visit from a humpback whale. I don't know if you were swimming on Sunday morning.
Yep.
Um,
Everyone was very excited, and I didn't see a thing.
no, nobody was brandishing. Right? Yeah, it's always the way, isn't it? And nobody was brandishing a sword. I'm assuming we're better at identifying sea creatures now and respecting them.
But we should switch to you, really, Shona. I mean, as you say, there's the most enormous canon of. Now we've started looking into it. There are so many examples of great and not so great literature about swimming. Um, but you wanted to bring us sort of up to date a little bit, and to talk to us about Roger Deakin,
Yeah.
who isn't really the same as great epic poems from the 5th century AD. So tell us a little bit about Waterlog.
Okay, well, yeah, this is quite a giant leap forward in time. But when we were discussing Beowulf, and thinking about what we were going to say about it, and then it made me think about what is a heroic swim, because, Byron's swim, that was a feat of achievement. And Beowulf, even though fictional, surviving in 7 days in winter Norway, and fighting sea monsters, that's, certainly impressive. But in a smaller way, I find Roger Deakin quite heroic because, for one thing, he embarked on the series of wild swims across Britain just by himself as a sort of journey of self-discovery. But also his book Waterlog, which came out in 1999, has inspired so many other people to get in the water and think about water conservation. And I guess that's a different kind of heroic legacy to leave. I don't know have you read Waterlog, John?
No, you're embarrassing me.
No, sorry. No pressure. Well, I haven't read Beowulf, so it's fine. So Roger Deakin was this British writer who lived in Suffolk, and he was quite unusual in that he owned a moat, which not many people can say that they own a house with a moat. But he lived in this cottage, which was built in the 16th century, known as Walnut Tree Farm Cottage, and it came with its own moat, which, in the book he explains was sort of a status symbol at the time, that people would sort of dig these moats. And his one happened to be sort of fed by an active spring, and so it kept the water fresh. And so all year round he would swim happily in his moat with, frogs and lilies and pondweed, and it all sounds quite idyllic. And the only time of year he would stop is when it froze over so thickly that he could ice skate on it. So he was clearly comfortable with swimming in all seasons. But at the time he wrote this book, I think he wrote it in sort of 1996. His relationship had just ended, and his only child had moved away, and I think he was quite lonely. And I don't know if it was a midlife crisis or just something he randomly felt like doing, but he'd been inspired by a short story I think he'd read called The Swimmer, where the protagonist in the book swims home after a party via a series of swimming pools. And he thought, well, why don't I do the equivalent of that, but swim across Britain, in rivers and ponds, and sort of learn something as I go. And so it's sort of a travel book. It's quite a meandering style. Like, he does look at maps and make plans, but there's a lot of coming and going. One thing I really like about it, apart from the beautiful way he describes the places he swims, is that being written in the late 90s, the internet was around, but I don't think he refers to it, and he definitely doesn't have a smartphone. So he's not using GPS to locate places, and he's not Googling things as he goes. He's actually visiting libraries and looking through old maps and trying to rediscover these forgotten waterways that people swam in, 100 years earlier or something. And as a writer, I quite enjoy him describing his process of researching all these different places to swim. Yeah, and he talks about, it's quite sad in a way that all these beautiful places have been forgotten, and some of them are still used and celebrated, and other rivers have gotten polluted. So, he does talk about environmental degradation and having to, look after our waterways. But basically, you can dip in and out of this book, no pun intended, and it's like a celebration of swimming. Yeah, and so if people haven't read it, then I would definitely recommend it. And yeah, I guess a question for you, John, not to put you on the spot, is like, what would you consider heroic swimming? Like, is it a long swim? Is it a cold swim? Or is it a any sort of swim that you might do out of your comfort zone?
Yeah, surely they're about adventures, aren't they? And adventures can be in your moat or in the middle of the ocean.
I really need to dig myself a moat, I think. Yeah. Oh, that reminds me, I was just going to read the first
Oh,
paragraph
great.
of the book, yeah,
Yep.
where chapter one is called The Moat, and that's where the story begins. So he writes, the warm rain tumbled from the gutter in one of those midsummer downpours as I hastened across the lawn behind my house in Suffolk and took shelter in the moat. Breast stroking up and down the 30 yards of clear green water, I nosed along, eyes just at water level. The frog's eye view of rain on the moat was magnificent. Rain calms water, it freshens it, sinks all the floating pollen, dead bumblebees and other flotsam. Each raindrop exploded in a momentary bouncing fountain that turned into a bubble and burst. The best moments were when the storm intensified, drowning birdsong and a haze rose off the water as though the moat itself were rising to meet the lowering sky. Then the rain ceased, and the reflected heavens were full of tiny dancers, water sprites springing up on tiptoe like bright pins over the surface. It was raining water sprites. It was at the height of this drenching in the summer of 1996 that the notion of a long swim through Britain began to form itself. I wanted to follow the rain on its meanderings about our land to rejoin the sea, to break out of the frustration of a lifetime doing lengths, of endlessly turning back on myself like a tiger pacing its cage. I began to dream of secret swimming holes and a journey of discovery.
Raining water sprites. That's beautiful.
Yeah, he writes very poetically. Yeah, and it's just amazing the way he had this idea of swimming across the country and actually did it and wrote about it. I find it
And
very inspiring.
much more accessible than either fifth century epic poems or stupid rhyming couplets from the from the
Oh,
19th.
actually,
But
I was going to say one of the sad things is that Roger Deakin died about 5 years after this book was published. He had a brain tumor, and so he lived to see it published and saw that it was a success, but he didn't live to see the sort of legacy it created. Yeah,
absolutely. And there is this amazing tradition, as we were saying earlier on. Um, and we probably haven't got time to sort of go into it now, but if people are keen, there's a book which apparently is very highly thought of, which was published in 1992. It's called Haunts of the Black Masseur, The Swimmer as Hero. So it was actually written for your podcast, Shona, 30 years before you thought about
very
having one.
prescient.
Um, and somebody described it to me as the greatest book about swimming. So I went through all sorts of hoops to try, and I couldn't even find it on Amazon. I don't think I couldn't get it for my Kindle, so I had to get a copy posted to me from the UK and whatever.
Very old school.
And I found it completely unreadable. Actually, it was very hard work. But he talks about Byron and Hero and Leander and all that stuff, and poets, more modern British poets like Swinburne, and even John Betjeman, who's this sort of very jolly sort of war period poet who I thought we could finish with. And it's this little skit. We were talking about him earlier on about Captain Webb, the Dawley man. So Captain Webb, the first man to swim the English Channel. And Betjeman says, we saw the ghost of Captain Webb, Webb in a water sheeting, come swimming along the old canal to the Sunday evening meeting. And that's the low point of the podcast literary quality. But there's masses in this book. He's got all the stories about records and some of the adventures rather than the great the great sort of literary pieces about swimming, the different styles of the Spartans and the samurai, where the German professional swimmers were competing with the English amateurs like Captain Webb, the collapse of the American champions at the Los Angeles Games in 1932, before a Japanese team defeated them, headed by an 8 stone 14-year-old. Unbelievable. So much. And then there are loads of recent books, which probably are an entire podcast. You need to get one of your intellectual young Kiwi friends to come on and talk about these, Shona. But the book, lots of people have read The Swimmers by Chloe Lane. That was published about 5 years ago. Where We Swim by Ingrid Horrocks, published about the same sort of time. Book by Annette Lees a few years earlier called Swim, A Year of Outdoor Swimming in New Zealand. And then, of course, you've had Kate Camp on the podcast talking about her own poems. And her most recent book of poetry, Makeshift Seasons, she read us this beautiful poem called Freyberg Car Park, all about Graham watching us all come and go. But maybe that's where we should...
Well, that brings us full circle, because you just mentioned Freyberg Car Park, which was named after Bernard Freyberg.
Indeed. So we started with him and finished with him.
Yeah. I mean, the car park is not particularly glamorous, so should add that Freyberg Pool and Freyberg Beach are also named after him. Not just the car park. The car park just happens to be between the pool and the beach.
But it's got a lovely view.
It does, yeah. It's a very nice car park. Thanks for listening to this episode of Swim Chats. Please remember to follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if you enjoyed it, you can leave a 5-star rating and review, which helps other people find it too. Enjoy the water, and we'll see you next time.